Welcome to The Long Conversation. This is a unique format with live rolling 15-minute conversations with experts and leaders on U.S. China climate. This is a relay of two-person dialogues on what the future holds in the near and far future. We'll start with one speaker interviewing another, then the person being interviewed will turn around and ask the next person questions, and so on. We'll have 7 conversations with 7 speakers from all different backgrounds, including our CEO and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. We're going to stick to time. These conversations are a brief 15 minutes each. When the speakers hear 2 chimes, they have 2 minutes remaining. When they hear 1 chime, they have 1 minute remaining. This event is on the record and we are recording. Our full speaker bios are on our website and also in the chat box. So let's get right to it, starting with Zander Rose, the executive director of our event partner, the Long Now Foundation. Zander.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to do this format again and to be joined by Orville Schell. Orville, as probably many of you know, he's the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society in New York. But I think at the moment, he is joining us live from D.C. Is that correct? You're there at the opening of the Coal and Ice Show?
Yes, I'm at the Kennedy Center, where we have a tent which is the size of a football field, in which we've installed this multimedia show about the melting glaciers of the Himalayas and how what happens to them affects really every major river system in Asia. And our thinking is that, if people can, sometimes the written word runs out of sort of its ability to keep getting people to pay attention. So our thought was maybe if we did this visually through photography, through video, and we have events. We have a stage right in the middle of the exhibit to bring people in, and we're going to have Al Gore's coming to talk to Georgetown students. We have a whole panel with Alice Waters, Corby Cummer, Michael Pollan, whole series of people on food and agriculture, and it's going to go on for 6 weeks.
That's great. And is this the same show? I remember the last time we had this conversation was in Fort Mason in San Francisco with a version of this show. Is it the same show, or has there been stuff added, or how's that working?
As you well might appreciate, Zander, the climate challenge keeps morphing into new shapes. And so to hurricanes, typhoons, floods, and droughts, we've now added fire.
I can imagine. Yeah, no, obviously the fires here in California have been reshaping, I think, the way that we're all thinking about climate change as a much more present thing than it was. It's kind of has changed it from being a thing in the future to a thing very much in the present. So it's great to hear that you're adding that. Sad that we have to add it. And the one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about is how does the show come about? What was the inspiration for doing this versus any other way of getting people's attention on climate change?
Well, it started some time ago. I was in Beijing and my kids were in school and they had a vacation, and we thought, well, let's drive up to northwest of China and go and see some Buddhist grottos and Buddhist temples. So we went up to this very famous grotto called the Ouyang, Buddhist grotto in the city of Datong. And I'd kind of imagined it would be a sylvan place looking out across, green hillsides and other things. Eventually we got there and found that it looked out over 10 coal mines, a whole rail yard filled with trains, covered, just heaped with coal, and that the city was one of the most extraordinarily degraded places I've ever been in my life. So at that moment, that was sort of my road to Damascus, where the scales fell from my eyes, and I thought, well, coal is something that's got to be dealt with. So that's the genesis of it. And then a friend of mine we were doing some films for Frontline in Tibet, and we were in Lhasa, and he'd been up Everest 5 times, and he kept talking about how the glaciers had been changing and melting. So we decided we'd get the old photos from George Mallory's expedition in 1921 of the glaciers around Everest. And then he went back, a laborious process, and he found the exact places where Mallory photographed them, and he shot them again. And then when you see, and they're on a 50-foot screen in our show, what happens in the intervening century, it's pretty stark.
Yeah, no, I remember those are it's a beautiful kind of photo set series. A friend, another Long Now speaker, Ed Bertinsky, did some photography of those coal mines, I think, that you referred to, that are just
beautiful.
It's like beautiful photos of like kind of the most horrific parts of the planet.
Exactly, beautiful in a horrible way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I remember you spoke with us back in 2006. And one of the most vivid stories I remember you telling was that you wanted to take the family to go see the sun because you hadn't seen it in so long because of the air pollution, and you were driving for days and never really found it, and then eventually turned around and came home. And is that still the reality in those parts of China?
It improved a little bit on its air quality, but still, it's the largest user of coal and the largest emitter of carbon. So, I mean, there were periods where you could go for literally weeks and never see the sun. And, when I first went to Beijing in the mid-'70s, it was famous for its azure blue sky. And I don't think many people have seen an azure blue sky in the last couple decades.
Right. And I mean, I know that you work with a lot of groups around climate change, and one of the things that we were talking about before the show was, what is the role of some of our largest world governing organizations like the UN in this space? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I mean, I think they're heroic, in what they do, and they are the ones who sort of first alerted the world to this challenge in an organized fashion. But I think also, it's rather, they can't do it alone. I mean, people are sort of used to their reports and used to the COP meetings that happen, around the world. And I really think that, now we have an invasion of the Ukraine. We have a pandemic. We had an invasion of our own capital, which is always very distracting. But, climate change isn't taking a vacation. And just because it can't get the attention it deserves doesn't mean it doesn't deserve it. And I think so. The challenge, I think, for those of us who are concerned, and it should be everybody, is to try to find different ways to make people pay attention. I heard there was a concert that Yo-Yo Ma gave in the Greek theater, and at the end of it, he came to us to Beijing 10 years ago when we first launched this effort. And at the end, he did a little piece. Just to finish off, it was a Bach chorale called Wachet auf, which means wake up. And that was his message to us, to just bloody wake up. Now, how you get people to wake up is another question. And that's what we're struggling with. And perhaps we can galvanize not just politicians, but businessmen, artists, scientists. I mean, the whole of the social fabric will be able to make some greater progress.
Nice. Yeah, no, it seems, I think there's this kind of larger question of, I feel like everyone at least is conceptualizing the climate change problem right now. I think the interesting thing about the pandemic was you would think that this would be the moment where the world would be able to at least think in one kind of way about a thing. And it didn't really play out that way. And even with an absolutely imminent crisis of millions of people dying in 2 years, it's curious to me that I mean, I am a very optimistic person, but I kind of saw the pandemic as this, moment of like, oh, we see the meteor that's about to hit the earth. and like now we're going to unite. But it was curious how that did not happen. There was many different strategies that were played out, even within the United States, within the world community, and so it's I don't know if it's very hopeful, but it might be at least instructive for how things may play out even further. So I'm curious what your thought is on that. I mean, we have obviously the Asian world are some of the now largest emitters as countries, but with the United States as the largest emitter per capita, how this is going to, how we can potentially unite around any of these things.
Well, I think, Zander, that really is the question of all questions. And for those of us who've been working with China, which is the most critical partner of all, because it is the biggest emitter of carbon, I would say that, what has been happening in the last few years is incredibly discouraging, because we had engagement was all about getting together on certain issues, if not on everything, and to try to work things out. And with the end of engagement, and with worse than that, decoupling, and now an invasion of the Ukraine where China's ending up on the wrong side, it's going to be harder than ever. And so I fear that what we're going to be looking at is the best possible scenario is that countries working in parallel, if at all, but not together. And one would have thought that if there was a common interest that could bind us up, this would be it. But no, humans are mortal, and they've chosen to run away and get snarled up in other issues, which are not as I think, elemental to our survival.
Do you think some of the kind of more localized effects of climate change, like, really high heat events, or even the fires that we're seeing, or the air quality in places like China and Southeast Asia, do you think they're going to potentially cause some states to take acts like in a geoengineering space? Have you seen anything about that, where they might actually just act more unilaterally rather than as a global government?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about such remedies, but of course, such remedies are rather alarming because we do not know the consequences. If you start meddling with the atmosphere and putting, sulfur dioxide or aluminum foil or something up there to reflect the heat, it's very hard to know what you're going to get. So I think there may be a temptation for countries to do things unilaterally. States probably have less of a wider portfolio of possibilities. I think states already and subnational entities are doing a lot. California certainly is, with electric cars, with fuel standards and building codes and whatnot. But it is a great. I think one looks at the overall tableau with a certain amount of pessimism that even our states in the United States of America cannot get together.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd love to loop this back a little bit as I know we only have a couple more minutes left, but the Ukraine invasion by Russia and the alignment with China obviously has an interesting geopolitical effect, but it's also the driving up of fuel costs is possibly one of the best things for electric car adoption ever. I noticed that a friend of mine was looking at getting a car like my little Fiat 500 electric, and what I paid for it 4 years ago is now doubled on the used market all of a sudden. So there's these kind of funny interplays, both of the geopolitical situation of Ukraine and the increase of fuel price. Is actually, I mean, fuel is expensive in all kinds of ways, right? It's not just expensive in the abstract sense. It's expensive in this larger sense of, all of a sudden when something like this invasion happens, we're paying in a way the real price of fuel. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the only problem is that yes, the fuel may price itself out of the market by rising to a level that people can't afford. But alas, you can't buy an electric car now. There aren't any.
Right.
And now we have all sorts of supply chain problems. And it's more and more difficult to ramp up electric car manufacturing. So I mean, there's so many things sort of working one against another that it's really hard to see how this plays out. But the only positive thing I can say is that we are at an inflection point. And forgetting Russia and China for a minute, the rest of the world is in fact coming together on lots of things. And this will provide, I believe, a context for greater, remedy in the climate front.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, could you say, maybe in our last minute here, can you say just a little bit about the China-Russia nexus that we're now seeing? It's an interesting we know those two powers have interplayed for a long time, but this is now becoming a very relevant time for that.
It is, and what makes it so difficult is that on January 4th, just before the Olympics, Putin went to Beijing and basically got married to Xi Jinping with a 5,000-word statement declaring that their alliance had no limits and they were the closest of friends. And who knows what Putin told Xi about the invasion, whatever it was. China is now sort of trapped with Russia and doesn't quite know how to get out of that bind. So there's some very complicated diplomacy going on at the same time that we have issues like climate change hovering over us, but they are not what's paramount on the minds of Putin and Xi Jinping, I can assure you.
Indeed. All right. Well, we're going to have to end it there, and we'll hand you off for your next part of this conversation. I'll be seeing all of you in the audience at the very end of the conversation, and thank you so much, Orville. Talk to you soon.
Well, thanks, Zander, and thanks, Margaret, for setting all this up. So, now we turn to my dear friend, colleague, Li Chenjian, who quickly had come to this country, taught at Rockefeller University, is a doctor, a cancer researcher, but primarily a neurologist, went back to Beijing to Peking University to reformulate China's life science program there, and is now in the process of moving back here. I think he's ideally situated to answer some of the questions that lie at the heart of this great challenge that I've just been discussing with Zander. So, ChanChan, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start here. I'm very curious to know, we've always prided ourselves in America as being the children of the Enlightenment, which presupposes that we respect science, logic, reason, research, deduction. And yet, we have a tremendous number of climate deniers. Do you see any of that? You've just returned from China about a month ago. Do you see that China has any such afflictions, any such tendencies?
Yeah, good question. I think the acceptance of climate change itself isn't that bad in China, curiously. The general public, first of all, doesn't quite think about these questions, and the intellectuals are largely, from my circle, do recognize the problem of climate change. So science-wise, it's actually okay. However, I think China has another side of a problem, which is even if the problem exists, what has that to do with me? That kind of attitude. The argument is not really on whether there has been a climate change and whether if that change is real, the world is in big trouble. Instead, the argument is, yes, if we want to do something and we should do something, why we should be the one who make the sacrifice. And you and Zander just mentioned the emission per capita or total emission question. So China as a whole, yes, it is the greatest emitter on Earth. However, if you look at the emission per capita, it's not nearly on the top. So from the general public's point of view, it's, well, we have 1.4 billion people. If we are going to make sacrifices, shouldn't be that the advanced, developed countries who should cut their emission per capita. So it's a different way of denying the responsibility to fight climate change, not as so much to the science point, but as the who has the responsibility to act first.
And what do you think the effect of the economic downturn, which looks like it may be global, what's the effect of that going to be on China?
I think I'm no economist nor a political scientist, but from my view, yes, it will have a major impact because a downturn of the economy impacts every aspect of the science and technology development of climate science, of execution of those detailed practical measures that can reduce emission. I can tell you one specific case. Last year, the government of Beijing area really tried to change from coal-based energy to natural gas-based energy. So it's cleaner, it's less pollution, and that takes a lot. And a lot of things were not as smooth as the government wanted, and they had to go back and forth. So if the economy goes not smoothly and has a downturn, I assume the government, first of all, has less money to implement these things. And the second, maybe it will have to adopt some intermediate measure rather than effective but more drastic measure to fight those climate changes. So, and then also it slows down the true science and technology research. So that even though the degree of that change is still a big question on my mind, but I'm sure categorically we will see a weakened effort for sure.
So, I mean, how do you look at the whole U.S. China relationship, which is increasingly fraught? And I think there's going to be, there's already been a lot, there'll be a lot more blowback from the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia and China's association with Russia if it doesn't pivot rather quickly. And it seems very reluctant to do so. How do you think that's going to impact the efforts that people like John Kerry are making with Chenjian Li to try to confect some sort of a joint effort?
Yeah, the geopolitical factor is way beyond my knowledge base. But again, categorically, I think the two countries are representing two very different ideology, political system, and social culture. They were on a quote-unquote convergent path for quite a while, for more than 30 years. But recently that has stopped and in a certain sense reversed to everyone's sort of dismay. I think currently, unfortunately, the decoupling sense has started in both nations, in China as well as in US and US-led alliance. That's very unfortunate. Now, in this discussion, there are different subtle but important differences that I want to raise the awareness of. For example, whether it's a clean-cut total decoupling or it's a smart decoupling, or also we can name it principled engagement rather than a full-scale without vetting kind of engagement. If we can do it in a smart way, we know that there are areas people have trouble collaborating, but there are areas we just have to work together. And I think number one issue is this climate change and the science technology policy around it. That seems to be a no-brainer to work together, because if we don't work together, well, many years later, both New York and Shanghai will be under the water anyway. So this is to everybody's interest, selfish interest, to work together. I'm wondering if both sides have the intelligence and the sincerity and a sense of urgency to carve out some of those things to keep working together instead of a full-scale decoupling. If we can do that, that will be a good news for mankind, I will say.
But of course, I think you're correct to say that we should be very astute and judicious about where we decouple. However, we just have a living example right now with Russia of what happens when push comes to shove and a real crisis, particularly one of a military nature, arises. There is no subtlety there. There is no smart decoupling. It's just all on, all off. And I think, I wonder what you think about the prospect of that happening, let's say in the South China Sea, let's say in Taiwan, let's say on the Indian border. I mean, there's so many hotspots.
Yeah, again, those are not my immediate expertise areas, but as a citizen, a global citizen, looking at China, at US, and the whole world, I think you're absolutely right. I and my friends are worried every day what will happen in those areas and on those fronts, because there is no easy answer to those potential conflicts. And it seems like both sides have drawn the red line. And unfortunately, those red lines, they do cross each other. So I think the geopolitical concern is very, very serious. And you're right, when the situation such as the Russia-Ukraine situation occurs, then it's almost a binary result. It's either yes or no. Either we fight or we not fight. I really pray that that will never happen between China and the United States and its allies. So I don't have a good answer to that. However, as of now, I think we still have room to carve out the climate change side. It's possible still. And I will give you two examples that I experienced. The first one is Cornell University, my alma mater, has a collaborative tech grants, which is handled by its China Center in Beijing. And it bridges faculty members in Chinese universities and Cornell University professors. If they work on climate control and its related issues, you will get a grant. And so far, it's working quite well, given the tension between the two nations in the recent several years. So I would say those are the good things that we can still work together. The second example is I was on the Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee for quite a while. And one of those candidates, a brilliant young kid, who is going to study the energy aspect of science technology development. And we, the selection committee members, when we saw this kid and his explanation and his sincerity, it almost brought us to tears. So it was a unanimous vote to get this guy, to give him the best education and support as we can. And the student explained that it might be already too late, but we just have to do something still. And that attitude was very touching. And I think to your question, I think that's the attitude I will have too. There are so many things just going not to the right direction, but we just have to do the best we can when we are not 100% failed.
Of course, the essence of science, and particularly in the United States, is that it's a collaborative effort with people from all over the world. The best in the world come here to study. But now we have no Russians, and it could come to pass that we have no Chinese. What's that going to mean for the scientific world and for climate change, which is basically tech science driven if you're looking at the need for remedy? We only have a minute or two left, but go ahead.
Yeah, I really hope the United States will allow Chinese students and scholars to come and work on these global grand challenges. It's to the world's benefit, and it is to the interest of United States for sure. Just to give you an example, 88.5% of Chinese students who got their PhDs stayed in this country. It made really good contribution to science and technology.
Well, we have literally less than 60 seconds. Are you optimistic about when you can look at the climate challenges that we confront and you look at the prospects of the U.S. and China being able to do something together?
Yes, I'm still optimistic, cautiously optimistic.
Well, good. It's wonderful to talk to you, ChanChan. And
likewise.
We will remand the few remaining seconds back to the common wheel. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello. It is a pleasure and privilege to introduce the next panelist, Jennifer Holmgren. Jennifer is the CEO of LanzaTech, a company dedicated to develop the science and technology for carbon capture and transformation. So Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure to listen to this discussion so far. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, Jennifer, as we all know that the climate change, that line truly belongs to what we call the global and the grand challenges. It has so many aspects. It has policy, legal aspects. It has public participation, discussion, education aspect. And I would say this one has an unusual percentage, which is a science/technology aspect to it. And you are right at the front line of that development. I wonder if you could share with us some understanding of, for example, what are the key technologies on the horizon that might allow us to fight this battle? And in particular, your work in LanzaTech, how is that important and how is that going to help us? Could you explain to us?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So I'm a firm believer that we're not getting out of this one without tremendous improvements in science and technology. We need innovation. We need to rethink how we source, use, and dispose of carbon. That is absolutely critical. And what I would also say is, because it's those three pieces that are important, then I have to say that what people refer to as the circular economy, taking carbon that's already above ground and using it over and over again to make the things we need, is really what we ought to be focusing on. It's a lot of ways of doing that, but I think that's critical. It's a perspective. I think the second thing I would say, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about what we do. What we do is we use biology. We have a natural organism that eats gases like you would find coming out of a flue gas in a steel mill. It captures those, eats those, and makes ethanol. Now, ethanol for us is not a blending component for gasoline. Ethanol is a raw material that carries the carbon and the energy from these waste resources. And then we can use that ethanol to make jet fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, polyester, polyethylene. And in fact, none of this is science fiction, because last December, Zara introduced a dress where the polyester came from what would have been pollution going up the flue in a steel mill in China.
I see. One technology question I have is, when we do these wonderful things, there is a cost-benefit question, meaning a lot of very wonderful, good ones, but if you want to apply it to real world, and then the calculation is, gosh, we're going to spend more energy to generate that. Is your technology going to have have you solved that problem, and how are we looking in that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And what we've been doing is our energy use is such that we see a life cycle emission reduction that's significant, more than 60 to 80% relative to, say, making gasoline or making a chemical ethanol. What's really interesting or important is we've always had this third-party validation, Roundtable for Sustainable Biomaterials, et cetera. So it's just not what we're saying. It isn't just our technology, though. There are plenty of technologies that are able to create a benefit, kilojoules in versus kilojoules out. But you've got to be really careful in thinking about these technologies. We are comparing systems that are hundreds of years old. Petroleum, we've been using petroleum as a feedstock for 125 years. And these new technologies that are getting a stage today are not at its most efficient. Petroleum production has been optimized for 125 years. We've just got all these new technologies coming into play. Sort of like the first cell phone was the size of a suitcase. We need to let these technologies move forward rather than say, well, you're never going to get the carbon reduction down, you're never going to get the energy footprint down, et cetera, et cetera.
I see. So it sounds very promising. I wish you the best of luck, and we hope to see it pushed to actual practice. Follow-up question is that on the tech development front, which you are leading that, I'm curious, how is the United States doing compared to other major nations? Are we doing okay, or we are falling behind? Especially what I'm referring to is from basic research, move on to applied research, then move on to development, R&D, and then commercialization and execution. How are we doing?
That's a great question, CJ. I would say that on the science side, I think we are the continued technology leader. I would say on the scale-up side as well, we're doing well. However, I think more and more, if we're going to go faster, there needs to be more public-private partnerships on the building of demonstration plants or first commercials, because you've got to compress the time. And it's very difficult to get capital for first commercial because of the fact that there's still a risk adjustment to be done if it's the first deployment. How are we doing? I think we're doing well. Could we do better? Absolutely. Do we need to go faster? Most definitely. And one of the things you were talking about in the prior discussion is concern about having scientists from China or other parts of the world be able to participate in the U.S. technology and university ecosystem. And quite frankly, that's the only way to be successful, is we need to be able to have diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, and different types of technical training to be able to solve these, as you call them, grand challenges. So I think one of the barriers to our success, frankly, is ourselves and what we do about our borders.
I totally understand your argument. An equivalent of your description is the first-in-class drug in my field. The very first one who have a new target, who has a new mechanism, and you're making the first drug, it's always most difficult because it hasn't been done before, and the failure rate is 99%. At that time, you go out and fundraising, God, it's hard.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah. The next one I'm curious is, let's say when a new technology is available, but I think to make it truly useful to the world, we need to balance the commercial interest of the company or the people who invented it and balance that. And the other side is the global urgent need to use it, right? I mean, shared IP and all that. How do we look like in that? Do you have a potential thinking? Let's say if you are successful, how to make it popular?
Yeah, how to diffuse the technology and globally, and especially of something where there's urgency like this. And you know, this is a difficult question. I do think that we ought to think about a couple of things. For example, these new drugs that we're talking about, like the Moderna and Pfizer, these were actually developed through tremendous government-private partnership, right? I mean, first of all, just developing mRNA was heavily funded in the United States by DARPA and others. And then after that, all the scale-up really came from massive funding that happened over the past few years. You know this better than I do, so please correct me if I'm wrong. And I see that in climate change too, tremendous support from the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, et cetera. So I think it is important. No private company is going to develop anything or put their best minds on something that they're going to have to give up all IP to, you know, and not be able to create revenue and shareholder value. I mean, that's just not how our system works. However, the fact that the governments have participated, I think governments ought to be able to come up with a way to share IP across jurisdictions while still compensating to some amount the companies that did it. I think, you know, it's funny. Over and over again, what I would answer this question is by we're smarter than the problem. We're smarter than the climate change problem. We're smarter than this IP issue. We're smarter than a lot of problems. We just have to choose to decide that there needs to be a creative solution, because you can't just tell companies, give up all your IP, and you certainly can't say, we're going to let people die on the other side of the world because we're not willing to move fast enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. In my field, if a new first-in-class drug, the success rate is about 1%, which means the pharmaceutical companies need to make money when they are successful for the next 99 failures.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you won't have new drugs, period. So I think that goes to every groundbreaking, paradigm-changing new technology. And the government, the private donors and universities, science foundations, somehow just need to prioritize this climate change science and guarantee, yes, we may fail 99%, and I want that 1% if it does exist. So I guess there's a long way to go to get policymakers, private sector, government support all together. And so that's what I think this problem is so big of a challenge. It goes way beyond scientists and private entrepreneurs.
Right.
Yeah, good. Jennifer, it's great. And you have been in this line of work for so long. I wonder if you have other important thoughts you want to share with us. I'm sure my questions are just amateur ones. Other ones you want to share or criticisms you have, or alarms you want to set or advocate for something. Could you give us some thoughts?
Well, thank you. What I would say is, look, this problem should be scaring the heck out of us, right? I think the Arctic was 40 degrees C. The Antarctic was 40 degrees C warmer than it should have been yesterday than average, and 20 degrees warmer up in the Arctic. Okay, and we're talking degrees C. This is what we're seeing, and it's catastrophic, and it's happening faster than we need to. And I really feel like we do not recognize this as the true enemy that it is. And we have so many things that paralyze us, excuses for inaction. You know, is this solution the perfect one? Is it ready? What should we be picking? Is a tax incentive the right thing to do? How do we deal with cross-border issues? How do we support developing nations? It feels like the debate is so long and the solutions aren't happening fast enough. And I think every once in a while we should all look at ourselves and say, what is the problem? How big is the problem? And how do we get past the little things that prevent us from making real progress? Because honestly, we are not solving this by ourselves.
I'm curious, in my field, in the end, we have two great agencies. One is National Institute of Health, NIH, and the other one, slightly smaller, it's NSF. So these serious questions are discussed by the best minds in our field, and they make very good recommendations. For example, I work on Parkinson's disease, and the Congress has a UDOL grant. It's set aside a certain money for Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. And we apply for UDOL Center grant. I wonder, in your field, are there either agencies like that or set aside government funding, major ones for those?
Yeah, absolutely. Tremendous amount of great funding in the US, in Europe, and I also see it in China and India. We're talking about government grants here in the US Department of Energy, across every part of the Department of Energy. So we're talking, for example, the Department of Energy Science Office, the Department of Energy Biomass Office, the Department of Energy Carbon Office. But we also see it in the Department of Defense, has been a huge supporter of alternate energy solutions. They consider climate change a multiplier of, and so it's very important to impact it. So we see a lot of that. And the National Academy has done a great job of reviewing what's available in their studies and then making recommendations back to the Department of Energy. I see the same thing in Europe with funding across all spectrums. I see it in India, and I've seen it in China with the Chinese Academy of Science. So I'm seeing a lot across the energy support system.
I see. I will use Orville's concluding question. Overall, are you optimistic, pessimistic on the possibility of we together as global citizens solving this tough problem?
Yeah, absolutely. We have to solve it, and we always rise to the occasion. I expect mankind to rise one more time.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I've learned so much, and nice talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, CJ. My great pleasure. Thank you. So, okay. So I shall be chatting with Kevin Rudd. And Kevin Rudd is the president and chief executive officer of the Asia Society, and obviously a leading international authority on China. You might know him as the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, but we're lucky to have him and his views on how to work with China. I don't see Kevin.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Very good. I was speaking to Zander, and I knew that wasn't you. It's such a pleasure. It's wonderful to have you with us, and I'm grateful. If I may, I'd love to ask you a few questions, and let me begin with a trivial one. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on how to navigate the U.S.-China relationship, both generally and at this time, at this point in time.
I think if we're approaching this from a climate perspective, which I certainly do, it's important to categorize the U.S.-China relationship in three ways. One is that set of strategic concerns between Beijing and Washington, which are currently irresolvable. Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, cyber, space, etc., but which are potentially lethal unless they are properly contained and controlled. And so for those reasons, it's quite important to have a mechanism between Washington and Beijing which identifies what they are, and then secondly, has a mechanism for managing within strategic guardrails those really hard-line security questions so that they do not destroy the overall relationship. The second category is what I call the category of strategic competition. And that is those areas which are non-lethal in nature, but where there will be a highly competitive relationship between the two countries, by which I mean in trade and investment, capital markets and technology markets, and in talent markets, and even more broadly on the question of ideology and human rights, where there is a contest between the two sides, a contest for foreign policy influence, a contest ultimately for geostrategic advantage, but not a directly lethal conflict. That's the second category, and that's to do with what I call strategic competition. And the third category is this, defined areas of strategic collaboration, where it's in the national interests of both sides to work together in areas where there is a common interest. The biggest one, of course, is climate, for the simple reason that the Chinese domestically are preoccupied with unclean water, unclean air, and unclean soil, giving rise to premature deaths, poor food quality and poor water quality, and of course, climate change over time. But of course, it's not the only area where they could collaborate. There are others as well. If we have another round of the pandemic, ideally that would be an area in which the two sides would collaborate as well. Global financial stability. So my overall comment back to you in response to your question, Jennifer, is this, is if you're trying to manage this crazy relationship between these two crazy countries, the United States and China, my judgment, having been in the middle of this for the last 30 or 40 years as a humble Australian, is you need a joint strategic framework which is capable of embracing simultaneously these three areas of strategic red lines, maximum strategic competition, and defined strategic collaboration, with climate falling in the latter category. Back to you.
Thank you. Actually, that's quite interesting, because if I then take the way you've segmented this, I see bleeding over from pre-competitive discussions around, let's call it pre-competitive discussions around big topics, things that we have to work together to solve, bleeding into where they have to compete, right? So you set a fundamental on climate change, but eventually is somebody going to make money from it or train their people to be ahead? And I guess, how do you think about that, and how do you handle that?
Well, climate change collaboration, it happens at multiple levels, as you know, in international collaboration and, frankly, commercial competition as well. What governments do when they collaborate is that they set policy guidelines. For example, carbon trading schemes where they exist, whether it's fixed price, whether it's floating price, or governments set regulatory environments such as mandatory renewable energy targets on the renewable energy supply side. Or you may introduce a whole series of pollution control mechanisms. Again, governments, the state does that. At a second level, corporations then compete, and whether they are American corporations, Chinese corporations, Australian corporations, and they compete within those policy parameters. But in doing so, they're also able to deploy a whole lot of private capital to turn those opportunities created by legislation and regulation into commercial opportunities. The most obvious in my own case, for example, in Australia, when I was Prime Minister, we legislated for a mandatory renewable energy target of 20% of total electricity supply from renewables by the year 2020. When we started, there was only 4% of Australian energy supply came from renewables. As of this year, we're now running at about 23% renewables. Now, corporations were able to operate within those parameters profitably by developing wind farms, by developing solar farms, by developing a whole bunch of other renewable energy options. And a number of new hydro plants are coming on stream as well. But the bottom line is they're able to make $1 by doing that, and so they should. The job of government is create the policy parameters, and within carbon pricing, an emissions trading scheme with an ultimate carbon ceiling within which then private corporations should be able to competitively operate. Back to you.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So then let's talk about this whole issue about who bears responsibility and how one can work across jurisdictions, right? Who pays? How do governments agree to that? Because that seemed to be something that popped out of Glasgow as a real roadblock. How do you think about the equity element and how to handle that?
Well, there are two elements of equity which we're always mindful of in terms of international climate change action. One is the traditional formula for equity, which is between developed and developing countries. That is, developed countries, namely the US of A and the Europeans, historically created an enormous carbon footprint through the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th through the 19th century and well into the 20th century. And as a result, created this enormous carbon burden, accumulated carbon burden for the world. Then, of course, along come a bunch of developing countries in the post-colonial period, in the post-war world, and said, hey, we'd like to develop as well and acquire the same living standards. So we're going to go through our own industrialization. Well, of course, when you're dealing with countries the size of China and India with mass populations, and even countries with lesser populations, whether it's Nigeria or Indonesia or elsewhere, if they develop the same per capita carbon footprint as the Europeans and the Americans did, guess what? You're going to destroy the planet before next Thursday afternoon. Mm-hmm. So therefore, when we talk in international climate negotiations of common but differentiated responsibilities, it is to create a level of equity between those sets of historical responsibilities so that those who are starting last and are most vulnerable in the overall economic development profile, that they are able to be given assistance in their renewable energy transformations. And that's the whole origin of the Global Green Fund, which was first conceived at the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change Action under the UN, which I represented as Australian Prime Minister at the time. The final point about equity, of course, is of those countries currently acting on climate change, then what the hell do they do when they find one of their number is not actually lifting their weight? And you then have an inequity in terms of the imposition of, let's call it a carbon price on net export competitiveness in country X, and a non-carbon price producing the same good or the same product or commodity in country Y, which then enters the market globally with a lesser price because there's no carbon premium. The European Union has come up with a response to that, which is the way to level that playing field is to add on top of the price produced by, shall we say, non-carbon compliant countries, a new export tax for those who are seeking to free ride or to free load on the International Carbon Management Scheme. I think they're the two equity considerations that I would answer your question with.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That's enlightening. I find it to be one of the most difficult parts of this whole process, which then leads me to one more question. Tell us a little bit about how Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine right now, impacts, in your mind, everything that you've just spoken of.
Well, again, thank you for the question, Jennifer, because I think as I answer this one, I'm supposed to then transition to asking Fan Dai some questions in the next 15-minute period. So I'll be brief on this. On the question of Ukraine and the war, the obvious impact has been for international energy markets to begin to add a war premium to the price of hydrocarbons so that energy prices in the United States and across the developing world, oil, for gas and even for coal, are currently going through the roof. Secondly, what's happening is that a lot of economies are scrambling for long-term secure hydrocarbon supply as the best way through this, as opposed to the alternative, which would in fact be to maximise immediate renewable investments so that renewable energy provides the local substitute for declining, as it were, carbon-based energy supply, which is characterised by geopolitical insecurity. The virtue of renewables is you've got them in your own backyard. They don't have to cross the Straits of Hormuz. They don't have to cross the Straits of Malacca. They don't have to go on a Trans-Siberian Railroad. They don't have to go on a pipeline, Nord Stream 1 or Nord Stream 2, full of geopolitical instability. If you've got renewables, solar, wind and the rest, they are physically in your backyard and able to be stored in your backyard with ever-improving battery technologies and storage systems. So I think people are drawing the wrong conclusions from Ukraine by just turbocharging back into carbon rather than creatively moving forward at scale into renewables. So I think I'll leave it there if that's okay, Jennifer, and happily take over the questioning of Fan Dai.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree with you more, by the way. Please go ahead and thank you again.
Good. Fan Dai, hi, how are you?
Hi, it's good to see you again, Kevin.
Likewise,
My
good
pleasure.
to have you in this series of interviews. Tell me your views, given your background, on how China is maximizing its economic growth at present, given a number of challenges domestically. One, if I look at this winter that has just passed, there are many, many reports in international economic media of China's domestic energy shortages and many blackouts or brownouts in parts of the industrial south of the country, leading to a question mark on the part of many in the Chinese system, which is transforming to renewable energy is terrific, but it's no good if I can't have energy supply and security now. And so I suppose my first question to you is, even before we get on to the hike in energy prices coming out of the war in Ukraine, is your views on China's energy policy, hydrocarbons versus renewables, given the experience of the last Chinese winter. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the question, which, yes, I quite agree with you as we saw some of those blackouts or brownouts recently in the winter times. And that kind of raised a lot of question around the what they call energy security. And oftentimes energy security has been an excuse or a true reason for some of the slowdown of their energy transition from which is highly relied on fossil fuels into renewables. I personally don't see renewables, especially scaling up with the percentage of renewables in the grid as a barrier. And from the energy security point of view. And actually, I like to use an example of a study we recently conducted at the Institute where we looked at it's a kind of plant by plant study where we looked at about basically the capacity of 203 gigawatt coal power capacity that probably takes up around 15 to 19% of the existing capacity, that those coal power plants could be retired earlier than what they were set to be, basically within the 14th and 15th five-year plan period. When we looked at those, the possibility of retiring those plants earlier, we, Kevin, I think what we just talked about the energy security and the equity perspective. So we looked at those factors that if we retire those plants earlier than expected, what would be the outcomes? Would that cause blackouts? Would that cause losses of jobs in those areas? And actually, surprisingly, after the analysis, even after we look into those factors, our conclusion is it's actually quite feasible and affordable to do so without putting the energy and the power grid at crisis. So I think when I try to approach the question of energy security or the energy transition overall in China, I try to kind of look into those numbers and especially divide them into different factors and see what would actually happen. If we pull the trigger of so and so, what would actually happen? So after the analysis and using the example of this coal phase down study, I'm quite confident that China is actually capable of doing more in its energy transition and actually in a faster pace.
If the transition is occurring in the way in which you suggest, how fast is coal and hydrocarbons being phased out, and how rapidly are renewables being phased in, or other sources of energy, such as nuclear? Does that have a role as well? Back to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I would answer the second part first, which is nuclear, whether or not nuclear should be in the picture. I do think, ideally, we would love to see a smooth transition, right away from fossil fuels to renewables without having to using nuclear. But I think if you look at the reality, nuclear is actually a really good source of energy for during the transition. So I personally see nuclear as a source probably in the picture as a stepping stone for China during this transition. And the other part of your question, I think there is not a right or wrong approach here. It's more of how fast and how rapidly and how reasonably they could do this from different regions in China. I certainly see there are more opportunities or advantages in the eastern part of China as they have more access to different types of renewables. Of course, some western part of China too have very good resources for wind and solar. But I think there is a really big challenge here is about how much of renewables could be off-taken into the current grid, because China's grid system, and we often call it grid modernization, right? It was set up to harmonize a lot of fossil fuels in the past, in the old days. And so how do we really prepare the grid? And that goes back to the stability and security question. How do we make sure the grid is ready for a larger take of renewables? And I think that's the question that China is exploring, but there is not going to be a really fast solution because we understand how the grid system was set up for. So I think that will continue to be a challenge. And I think, again, the eastern part of China, probably because of the more resources, more type of renewables they can access, could probably demonstrate a model that the rest part of China could follow in the future.
It's interesting what you say about the grid, because my recollection from my time in China is that you have a China grid, which controls most of the transmission system north of the Yangtze. And then you have, I think, Southern Grid, which controls the rest. Correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying that the current physical infrastructure of the grid controlled by those two huge state-owned enterprises at present is not technologically designed to take offput of renewables into the grid? Is that correct?
Yes, I think and try to get into some more details here, but I'm not a technical expert. My understanding is to equip the grid with more percentage of renewables, you'll need to be able to harmonize the load, from the peak time and not peak times, and that will require a lot of storage. And what the grid system currently is, they're really strong at high voltage transmission from region to region, which does not necessarily work for the renewable load, in those regions. And so I think the question could be how they figure out with, maybe renewables plus storage, or how they, shift from the source of energy from renewables to the, maybe nuclear and some different type of fossil fuels to make sure that they can balance the load during the day and they can balance the load from region to region. And I think that's a question that, essentially they'll have to resolve. So make sure their grid is ready for picking up more percentage of renewables.
Last question, my dear friend Fan Dai, is this. These two crazy countries, China and the United States of America, given all the geopolitical problems emerging from Russia-Ukraine, what's your own baseline analysis of the future of bilateral collaboration on climate change in the period following COP26 at Glasgow and as we lead up to the subsequent COP meetings? Is it still going to be possible? Is it going to be more difficult? What can be achieved? Last question to you before I hand the floor to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I do, from my perspective as a researcher and have been working in this area for more than a decade now. My intuition is the road is, always been bumpy, and it's hard to predict the bilateral relations. But I think, and I remain hopeful that climate will remain one of the most important areas that we would continue to see collaboration, and we would continue to create opportunities for collaboration. My reasons are, one, I think, as many have said, climate is something that does not respect jurisdictions in different regions, or it's a common problem that we all will be facing together. So there's no way, we could change that by saying this is the U.S. or this is China, and whether or not they're going to work together. The other reason is I think, and this goes back to a lot of my research and previous work, I think there's a lot of untapped potential at the subnational government level and even in the private sector. I think when we talk about the bilateral relations, oftentimes we think of the country, the national leaders, right? It's a lot of politics and international relations. But in reality, I think the subnationals, the provinces, the states, the cities are the places we see most of the progress, and other places at the frontier to test out those climate solutions. So I think they would work together, and they have to collaborate and be able to expedite the process of the transition that we're talking about today. In the private sector, look at those companies. I think they are being the labs for a lot of those innovation and technological partnerships. So I think these are places that could contribute positive, vibrant, positive energy to the bilateral relations. On the other hand, I do think if countries, not just the U.S. and China, could look at the common interest and could empower their subnational governments and their corporates to do more and lead more of the execution of those solutions and policies, I think it would also help. It would also help, bridge the gaps between the countries and also help share more understanding of those problems that we're trying to resolve and the solutions that we can come up with.
Good, thank you. I've now run 1 minute over. 小芳，感谢，多谢，谦谢。Over to you. You get to conduct the next series of interviews. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I am supposed to interview Ouyang Bing, who is a dear friend and colleague. Ouyang is the Associate Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at Asia Society. So Ouyang, if it's okay, I'd like to start with a really general and broad question to you. I know you worked as journalist in China and you've been living in the States for years. So my first question to you is, as a Chinese and in America and experiencing, you probably have a lot of stories to share in the U.S. China relations front. What is the most or the biggest change that you would see, you would think, or you would describe in the U.S. China relations over the past 5 years, and how do you see climate come into the picture and evolving role of climate in U.S. China relations?
Okay, hi. Stefan, nice to see you finally here. And so that's a very good question to ask, especially under the current situation. I would say the experience or the feeling about this as a Chinese living in America now, it's weird. Because, as a lot of the Chinese come into this country, I come to this country 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. I think as a lot of my Chinese fellows, we saw this country, America, as an example as a good teacher or a better future to not just to China, but to the whole world. We come here to study, to learn, and actually we learned a lot and we enjoyed a lot. But the things changed dramatically, especially during these 5 years. As everyone can know, a lot of things happen in this country and happen in the whole world. So especially now, U.S. China relations are going down. So as Chinese living here is feeling so weird. Personally, I can totally share how the Russian Americans feel right now here in this country. So I hope this kind of metaphor won't happen to us. Regarding to your next question, how the climate change issue come in this show, because actually this is related to the coal and ice. About 5 years ago, when we launched our coal and ice in Fort Mason, U.S. China relations were going to, it's not that bad yet, but it's going down. So we were thinking what we can do. And climate change is a very organic answer because we have hypothesis. If everything goes ugly between these two countries, at least one thing could bind these two countries together, which is climate issue. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Yeah, it feels like climate would save the world.
Hopefully.
So again, and you used the word weird to describe the bilateral relations, and I think just hearing your answer, I feel there's a bit of concern or. It's not a bit. I think it's a big concern that you have about the bilateral relations. Do you just a following up question on your answer? Do you think climate, as we say, can save the world? How do you see climate come into this and maybe creating a window of opportunity for collaboration for the two countries? What is your take on that?
Yeah, the simple answer is just by reading news. When they argue to each other on almost everything, but at least there's something if they can sit down together to talk, to even co-work together, which is climate change issue. So like just as mentioned, John Kerry talked to Chenjian Huang, and because I think it's very easy to understand because these are two biggest economies. So they have to co-work together because, as you mentioned, the pollution has no border, right? So it's not something like, say, I can simply close my door and everything is fine. And no, it's just won't work. And you have to work with people and you have to work with another big player there, no matter you like it or you hate it. So I think it's not come from some like a friendship or goodwill. It's come from this is the way if you want to still living in this planet. So so I think this, but of course, sometimes the politics can go beyond our imagination. It's not always come with responsibility, but we hope if any leaders they come with responsibility, they would co-work together on this issue. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I feel like, yes, it is the urgency of climate and the catastrophic impact that climate change is bringing to us that makes no choice for not working together. Quite agree with you on that. So again, from your journalist perspective, oftentimes I've been posed questions, asking how would you judge the climate policy and actions in the US versus in China? I like to pose this question to you because I know you understand both the US and China deeply. So how would you describe the climate policy and action or progress in China versus in the US?
So, of course, America is a leading country under this topic, and China is quite interesting. I traveled back to China last year, by the end of last year, suffering through this quarantine and a lot of things. One of my big questions when I finally can face-to-face talk to my Chinese fellows there in Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen, I always ask this question: do you think the carbon neutral policy in China is real? Are they serious about this? Because, we are suffering pandemic, we are suffering economic going downturn, and is this still real? And we don't have that strong landslide where the history where education in the whole country about the eco-friendly things. So of this kind of answers I got is, yes, this is real, because when you look out, just simply look out through your window, you can say everyone loves the blue sky. And as Orville mentioned at the very beginning, the reason he launched this Coal and Ice, because he was traveling in China, and the sandstorm and the pollution of the air. Every Chinese has been through that. So now they know this is the way. As we always mention, a really rich and strong country is not just come with a bigger GDP, it also comes with a better life. And no one want to live in, highly polluted water, air, and their kids cannot even breathe freely. It's not a life every Chinese want, even including the leaders. So I think this time they're serious. But of course, there are big distraction, the pandemic. And sometimes, as you mentioned with Kevin, there a lot of suffering and the electricity problem. So, but I would say in the big picture, I would say China finally on this track. They are on board. So, yeah.
Great. That's really interesting to learn from your perspective. Maybe this is my last question, but it's also a big question, I think. I'm curious to learn from you. What would you see as the biggest challenge that is preventing or would prevent the U.S. and China from working together on climate? Do you think it's more of the trust each other, the trust issue, or it's more of actual, policy and progress on the ground, or something else?
Yeah, decoupling, I would say, because both sides, this kind of man side already set on the both sides. So when both sides both agree on this is the way we will head to, this is a big problem. I will give you one example. About 5 years ago, on the vineyard of the previous Coal and Ice, I launched a program called Young Green Tech, which is a platform we built to nurture the green entrepreneurs globally. And we host a lot of young, not dreamers, but also doers. They're like the average age is 32. They're golden age to be an entrepreneur. We saw a lot of, energy, innovation behind and the responsibility from the younger generation. And another feature of our program, YGT, is to mix people together because we believe in globalization and people can get a lot of inspiration from the people sharing some similar mission, but also come from with different background. And we saw it's true because we saw our young entrepreneurs talk to each other. I mean, the young entrepreneur from Shenzhen talked to a guy from Kenya, and also European entrepreneur chat with their American counterpart. But now decoupling is happening. So it's getting harder and harder for us to encourage the younger generation to, we're still doing this, but it's getting much harder than before, and to encourage them to sit down and to mix them together. So I would say, it's just, look now compared to the pandemic, look at the world, it's like a minor issue, but I would say this would be a big problem in future because we're talking to the next generation, what kind of world they are looking at. So I would be very concerned about this.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ouyang, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I think I'm supposed to hand it over to you and back to the Asia Society team. It's a pleasure for me to join today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Hello, everyone, again. And I supposed to interview Zander, our first interviewer. If you still remember, Zander is from Long Now Foundation. He is the executive director there. Hey, Zander, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Some rest?
Yes. Yeah, it's been fun listening to the conversation. It's been
okay, great.
Been as wide-ranging as I had hoped.
Okay. Let's start with Long Now Foundation. Actually, this is a very interesting, this is a foundation comes with a very interesting mission. You focus on 10,000 year topic. So how did this idea come from? Why you want to do this?
Well, the idea came from, originally it was a story that was told from one of our founders, Stuart Brand, who had founded the Whole Earth Catalog, and he told to a computer scientist named Danny Hillis, who'd been building the fastest supercomputers in the world. And he told the story about New College, Oxford, which is unclear how true the story is, but it's still a good story. It's just that they, when they built the hall for New College in the 1200s, they built it with these huge oak beams. And it wasn't until 500 years later in the 1800s, they realized these needed to be replaced. And you couldn't just buy them commercially then in Europe because they'd been, those forests had mostly been taken down. And it wasn't until they spoke to the school forester who said, well, we have the trees that you planted and 500 years ago when you built this hall. And so this idea, whether it's true or not, this idea that something like planting some acorns and paying attention to them for 500 years could solve a totally, a present problem that is totally intractable in the present moment, was a powerful idea. And Danny Hillis, then, who had been building the fastest computers in the world, thought, well, what if I built the slowest computer in the world, effectively a very, very slow clock that would tick once a year and bong once a century, and the cuckoo might come out once a millennium, as a way to, that would be monumental in scale enough that people would kind of visit it like they visit the Grand Canyon and see the depth of geologic time, or if you're looking through a telescope and you start to see the depth of astronomical time. but those kinds of times kind of dwarf the human experience. And so the goal was to create a thing in people's imaginations, whether they ever visit it or not, that holds this kind of human scale amount of time. And so 10,000 years was chosen as, roughly the amount of time since the last ice age retreated and agriculture began and cities started building around the world, as an amount of time that would stretch people's kind of perception of time, but also be within that human scale that you can realize that, that, let's say it's 25 years a generation, that's 400 generations. You could imagine maybe telling a story that could pass from 400 through 400 generations. So that was the idea. And we've been building this 10,000 year clock ever since. We have a number of other projects, but the clock was the main one that I was hired to work on almost 25 years ago. And we're starting to near completion out in the Texas desert now.
Well, cool. Very, very look forward to having a look at that cuckoo clock. But I want to challenge you here. So 3 years ago, we couldn't imagine there's pandemic costs millions of people's life. 1 year ago, we couldn't believe what happened in Washington, D.C. And 3 weeks ago, most of people in the whole world couldn't imagine there is a war. So is this kind of a 10,000 year idea still relevant to us?
Yeah, I mean, that's the trick. I mean, I think I think it's also worth teasing apart the difference between long-term thinking and long-term planning. And obviously you can't truly plan on timescales of 10,000 years. And we also realize that is an extreme timescale for most things. But in general, what we're trying to do is get people to think about time, kind of the civilizational attention span as longer than a quarter or a year, or even 5 or 10 years, and start at least think about it in generational terms, that, you want to hand the world off to the next generation with more options instead of less. I think it's probably, if there's one principle that I think is key to this, if we continue to hand off the world with less optionality into the future, our descendants are just going to be more and more handcuffed by the situations that they're in, and they're going to have wars. They're going to make decisions that are not optimal for the environment. But if we can, effectively plant those oak trees so that when they need them in 500 years, that option exists, and they get to decide. And the notion is not that we can possibly predict, that Russia might invade Ukraine this year, but we did 100% predict that a pandemic was going to happen. We predict all kinds of things: earthquakes, tsunamis. These are all natural disasters. There's good things also we predict, but these are things that I think are interesting. While they're 100% known that they're going to happen, like an asteroid impact, yet we don't plan for them. We don't give them the same serious kind of treatment that they deserve, when we 100% know they're going to happen, and that they're going to have this kind of large effect on the world. It's interesting to me. I mean, for instance, that the very first thing you would think a spacefaring society would do would build an asteroid detection and deflection program, because we don't want to just go out like the dinosaurs. But that's not what we do. We spent a bunch of time fighting with Russia over who's going to get to the moon first. So we're starting to kind of catalog all the asteroids now, and luckily no really large ones have hit. But the idea here is that how do you prioritize the types of things that you might think about if you were going to think long term? I also think what's interesting is kind of watching as we come out of the pandemic. There's actually very little kind of, this would be the best moment to do a lot of really good planning for the next pandemic. And so far, I'm not really seeing it. And I think it's the kind of thing that we might encourage. And it would be a great role for the WHO and, obviously the national agencies like CDC, but this idea that, there's all kinds of protocols were tried around the world, and that we now have this moment to capture all this data and say, wow, the Swedish model had some interestingly positive things. The American model was all over the place. It's all these weird states. There's the Hong Kong model or whatever. And so it's that we're in that moment where we could capture all this data and be really good about how we might preserve that for a future generation that might have a pandemic that comes, whether it's 50, 100 or 200 years from now, another one will come.
I'm Chinese, so we always there's a very strong how should I say belief in Chinese people. Learning history make you smarter. Is that true? And so, as you just mentioned, 10,000 years. I assume the hidden mission of this project to try to make us smarter. But let me ask this question smaller. How let's forget about the very big problem about our future. I mean, when we disappear or not. How can we make people truly believe climate change is real?
I'll be honest. For the most part, there are certainly pockets of the world, and certainly large amounts of them are here in the United States, where there's problems with how well people engage with climate change. But I don't think I've met anyone who doesn't think climate change is real at this point. I think our problem is not whether we think it's real. There's people wading through the streets on perfectly sunny days in Miami, like 30 days a year or more. And it's, it is very, very real. And then obviously the fires and extreme weather events really start to punctuate that as well. But the question to me is it's much more around things like the response to the pandemic question, which Orville and I touched on a little bit earlier, which is this, even with everyone, I think, like maybe not everyone, but at least a huge amount of the global society, cultures, governments believe it's real. The question is, what do you do, and who should do it first? And some of the other conversations this evening touched on this question of like, well, the United States is the largest per capita emitter of CO2. China is the largest emitter total of CO2. So and then they decide to face off as to who should do something first. It's like, no, we need to do something together, obviously. And this idea that which of those two things matters the most when the world is going in the direction that it is the wrong argument. So I think it has way less to do with belief and way more to do with what we might do in terms of coordination, who's going to start paying the big prices, are there going to be other economic models that can start getting on top of this, helping this problem in a way. And we also mentioned this earlier, is like in actually one thing that can help this is really high fuel prices. And there's nothing better that gets people putting solar on their roofs and electric cars and things like that than a really high, power bill or fuel bill. And so there's some of these economic forces that are going to help us, but there's clearly going to need to be a level of government coordination and intergovernment coordination that we have yet to see. And I think we've seen it in certain areas. We've seen it, at least attempted in the world's fisheries. The classic example that's held, very high is the one on the ozone depletion that was generally fixed, but we're also seeing some blips in that problem as CFC manufacturers in remote parts of China started coming back online. And so those are going to be the how do you create that level of international and even, I think it might just be in some way maybe inner municipality coordination, because I think so much of this really comes from cities, and cities have some of the best mayors have some of the most power, and regional governors have some of the most power in China, is my understanding at least. That I think if we connect a lot of those large kind of cities and regional governments, that could be enough. And they, I think, are so tuned to this because they're paying the price right up front. Whereas the national governments are kind of paying it in this much more offset way, like when they have to clean up after Katrina or something like that.
Yeah, great. I don't wanna waste this opportunity to ask another question is about the historical trend. Previously we are quite separate. I mean, as human beings, different monkeys living in different forests. Gradually, we are together. We have a globalization. Everyone seems similar, and bam, now suddenly decoupling everywhere. I mean, not just U.S. China, everywhere. Even within the states, a lot of issues people separate again. So, what's the historical trend you think after? 100 years later, we will be more like separate troops or more globalized?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. I think, this predicting something 100 years out like this is definitely a sucker's game. But I think, even if you look back 10,000 years ago, the basic needs and desires and hopes for people, I bet, were actually very, very similar to ours. And they wanted a better life for their children, and there was love, and there was a desire to have your basic needs met. And I think if you look at the trend of the last 10,000 years, certainly those trends of basic needs being met have gotten vastly, vastly better on average. And so I would hope to think that those trends continue. I think the question is truly, can we come together on this, or are we going to try and solve this in little tribes, as you mentioned? So we will see.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your sharing.
Absolutely.
And that's back to you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right. It is back to me. So thank you, and thank you all for joining this evening. And I'm going to hand it off to Margaret Conley, who organized this event. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Zander, for bringing us home and for reminding us that we have earthquakes, asteroids, and more pandemics to look forward to. Thanks to the Long Now Foundation for partnering with us again, and to all 7 of our expert speakers. Asia Society's Coal Plus Ice exhibition is up at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. for the next several weeks. Check it out. Please join us at our future events here in Northern California. All of them are listed on our website, and we're coming back in person. We have our Asia Game Changer West Gala on April 14th at the Four Seasons in San Francisco. We're honoring Asians and Asian Americans who have made remarkable contributions to society. We'll also be hosting a number of events for AAPI Heritage Month in May. Thank you again to our speakers and to our Northern California team. This was a fun challenge behind the scenes to put together. Big thanks to Rexel Uy, Angela Chung, Rahul Dvaskar, Nina Udagawa, and all of our interns. From all of us at the Northern California Center, thank you for joining us.